Usually when we think about a family inheriting this grand old estate, there's this built-in assumption of just permanent, unshakable wealth.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. You picture the sprawling gardens, the historic stone manor, the sheer weight of the legacy. You just inherently assume whoever lives there is completely set for life.
Yeah, you assume the hard work was done centuries ago.
Exactly. But then, say, decades pass,
Yeah.
and suddenly you visit that grand estate, and the roof is leaking, the gardens are wildly overgrown, and the current owner is anxiously looking at the heating bill, trying to figure out, which wing of the house they have to shut down for the winter.
Which is a pretty stark image.
It is. And meanwhile, their younger cousin, the one who moved out years ago to build this modern, highly practical beachfront property from scratch, well, they're sitting incredibly comfortably. They're hosting parties, practically swimming in disposable income.
And looking at that disparity, it forces a very uncomfortable realization. Because you have to ask whether the decline of the old estate was just, an inevitable consequence of time, or if the owner simply stopped doing the fundamental maintenance required to keep the foundation from rotting out underneath them.
And that exact dynamic, that staggering divergence in fortunes, is exactly what we are looking at today, but not with real estate.
No, we are looking at two massive global economies in the year 2026.
Welcome to the Deep Dives. We are unpacking a genuinely startling economic reality right now. We're looking at the dramatic and, quite frankly, rapidly widening wealth gap between the United Kingdom and its former colony, Australia.
And we have a massive stack of sources to go through today.
We do. We've got the latest April 2026 data from the IMF, the newest projections from the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility, and some really heavy-hitting NBER research. And they paint a picture that is almost hard to process if you still view the global economic hierarchy through, like, a late 20th century lens.
It is a profound structural shift. And the underlying mechanics of how we actually arrived at this 2026 reality, it opens up a massive defining philosophical conflict that we're going to explore today.
The big mission of today's deep dive.
Exactly. We have to examine this inherent tension between the necessity for complex, multi-decade economic planning and the short-term, sometimes highly volatile nature of direct democratic mechanisms.
Specifically, public referendums.
Right.
Now, just to be perfectly transparent with you listening right off the bat, when we get into the mechanics of these political choices today, specifically Brexit and the 2016 referendum, we are operating from a place of absolute neutrality.
Complete neutrality.
We aren't taking a political side. We aren't endorsing the ideology of either camp. We are strictly acting as your guides through the macroeconomic data, the structural arguments, and the historical evidence that our sources provide to explain this 2026 economic landscape.
Just reporting the numbers and the structural analysis.
Right. So let's get right into the reality check. Because the 2026 IMF projections for nominal GDP per capita, that is the anchor for this entire discussion. And the gap is massive.
It really is.
Australia is currently sitting at roughly $75,648 per person. The UK is trailing far behind at $61,056.
Right, which means Australia's per capita wealth is now roughly 24% higher than the UK's.
24%.
Yeah. And just to preempt the usual economic counter-argument here, because people always bring this up, yes, nominal GDP doesn't tell the whole story.
Because things cost different amounts in Sydney compared to Leeds.
Exactly. A cup of coffee isn't the same price. But even when economists adjust these figures for purchasing power parity,
which levels the playing field, right?
Right. It accounts for local costs of living and inflation rates. Even with that adjustment, Australia still maintains a remarkably robust 15 to 20% lead. This isn't just some statistical illusion caused by, currency fluctuations. It is a material structural divergence in national wealth.
And the momentum, or yes, the lack thereof, is where this gets truly concerning for the UK. If we look at the actual growth trajectories for 2026, Australia is just chugging along. They're maintaining a steady, healthy growth rate of around 2%.
Which is very solid for a mature economy.
But the UK economy, however, has essentially ground to an agonizing crawl. I mean, the IMF puts their 2026 growth at a microscopic 0.8%.
The OBR is trying to be a bit more optimistic.
Yeah, they have them at 1.1%.
Yeah.
But then you have the OECD downgrading their projection to a mere 0.7 to 0.8%.
Let's translate those abstract percentages into the actual lived reality on the ground, because that's what matters to you listening.
Right.
Take a place like Port Macquarie in New South Wales, Australia. In regions like that, you can physically see the manifestation of consistent 2% growth.
You feel it in the air almost.
You do. You see high living standards, lower unemployment, robust local investment, strong metrics in real wages, and constant housing development.
The economy just possesses a tangible vibrancy. There is this inherent expectation of upward mobility.
Then you cross the globe and look at the UK in 2026.
Yeah, the OBR is predicting that real disposable income in the UK will grow by exactly 0.2% this year.
0.2%.
That means the average person in the UK is fundamentally treading water. I mean, if your disposable income grows by 0.2%, you aren't feeling any improvement in your purchasing power.
Not at all.
You are just barely managing to pay for your groceries and your energy bills with slightly less margin for error than you had the year before.
And what makes this so jarring, historically speaking, is that this gap wasn't always baked into the international system.
Right, it wasn't preordained.
No. If you rewind to 1990, the UK and Australia were incredibly close in terms of economic standing and living standards. But over the intervening 3.5 decades, they took fundamentally different strategic paths.
The UK made massive structural bets that, as the current data shows, severely hobbled its long-term momentum.
Right.
Now, I do want to be careful not to paint like a total dystopian picture here. The UK is not a developing nation. It hasn't fallen off the map.
Oh, absolutely not.
It retains a massive global footprint. London is still an undisputed titan of global finance, legal consulting, and tech architecture.
It still has world-class creative industries, elite university clusters.
Exactly. But what we are diagnosing today is a severe relative decline.
Relative decline is the exact right framework.
Yeah, because it's falling behind its G7 peers.
Yeah.
And it's being entirely eclipsed by nations like Australia that used to be considered its absolute economic equals.
The UK economy is growing, technically, but it is growing so anemically compared to the rest of the developed world that its actual weight in the global economy is shrinking.
To understand how two economies diverge so drastically, I like to use an analogy. Think about the fundamental nature of what these countries actually sell to the world. It's the difference between a hardware economy and a software economy.
I like that.
Right. So Australia sells the hardware of the global economy. They literally dig up mountains of iron ore, millions of tons of coal. They pump vast reserves of liquefied natural gas, put it all on massive cargo ships, and send it to Asia to build physical cities.
It is undeniable physical wealth.
Exactly. But the UK, on the other hand, pivoted away from making physical things and became a software economy.
They sell financial structuring, insurance, intellectual property, and high-end consulting.
And software is incredibly lucrative, but it is infinitely more fragile.
It is.
It relies entirely on frictionless, interconnected regulatory environments to actually function.
And that fragility is precisely the vulnerability that has been exposed over the last decade. But to truly comprehend why the UK decided to abandon the hardware game and rely entirely on the software game, we have to look backward.
We have to dig into the roots.
We have to dissect the historical foundation of the modern UK economy. Because this isn't just a story about the last 10 years. This decline is the result of a historical triple threat that began the moment the Second World War ended.
Okay, let's unpack that triple threat, because it's fascinating. Threat number one is the massive post-WWII structural realignment.
Right.
For centuries, the British economic model was this imperial closed loop. The empire provided incredibly cheap, guaranteed access to raw materials.
Right, from all over the globe.
And those materials were shipped to massive manufacturing hubs in the Midlands and the north of England, turned into finished goods, and then sold back into captive imperial markets.
Where British companies didn't really have to compete on price or innovation.
Exactly. They had a monopoly. So when that imperial system dissolved after the war, the shock to the British economic system was monumental.
Suddenly, the UK didn't have captive markets anymore. They had to compete in a rapidly globalizing, intensely competitive open market.
And they quickly discovered that their domestic manufacturing base was woefully inefficient, especially compared to emerging powerhouses like West Germany and Japan, who had basically rebuilt their industrial bases from scratch with modern technology.
And they had deeply integrated management labor structures, which the UK definitely lacked.
But wait, let me push back on this a little bit. Is it actually fair to call this a decline? I mean, isn't this just the natural, unavoidable life cycle of a post-imperial, mature economy?
That's a very common counterargument.
For right, because you can't really expect a small island to compete in manufacturing against the rise of the entire Asian continent, can you?
Well, the argument from the sources is that while some shift was inevitable, the sheer scale of the collapse wasn't, which cascades perfectly into the second threat, taking us right into the 1970s.
Oh, the era of deindustrialization.
Right. This period permanently traumatized the British economic psyche. The UK literally earned the global nickname the sick man of Europe.
The manufacturing sector, which once accounted for well over 30% of the entire economy, began this free fall toward the single digits.
The 1970s in the UK were defined by structural dysfunction. You had the infamous winter of discontent, massive rolling industrial strikes.
The government imposing a 3-day work week just to conserve electricity,
Inflation was utterly rampant, peaking well over 20%.
which is terrifying.
It is. And the traditional manufacturing base was failing to modernize because management and these deeply entrenched labor unions were locked in constant, bitter conflict.
So instead of innovating, the state was forced to heavily subsidize failing, nationalized industries like British Leyland in the automotive sector just to prevent mass unemployment.
Then we hit the 1980s, and Margaret Thatcher's government initiates a brutal, massive economic pivot.
They essentially looked at the global landscape, saw the initial rumblings of Asian manufacturing dominance, specifically the rise of China and the Asian tiger economies, and realized the UK simply couldn't compete in heavy industry anymore.
Asian markets just had cheaper labor, newer facilities, and massive scale.
So the UK decided to lean heavily into its software advantage.
They aggressively deregulated. You have the 1986 Big Bang in the City of London, which utterly transformed the financial sector.
Tearing away old regulations and opening the doors to massive foreign investment.
Simultaneously, the state allowed vast swaths of uncompetitive heavy industry in the North and the Midlands to simply collapse.
And for a time, this gamble appeared brilliantly successful. I mean, the 1990s and early 2000s saw massive wealth generation.
Fueled in no small part by the temporary windfall of North Sea oil, which provided this massive revenue buffer during the painful transition.
But, and this is a massive but, that transition planted the seeds for the third threat.
A structural vulnerability.
Shifting entirely to a service economy created a catastrophic geographical and social vulnerability.
Yeah.
You had bankers, lawyers, and tech developers in London and the Southeast absolutely thriving.
Generating world-class wealth.
Right. But the former industrial hubs, the towns that used to build the hardware, were fundamentally starved of capital and new purpose.
And this intense geographical inequality birthed an entirely new, insidious economic crisis that crystallized right after the 2008 financial crash.
The productivity paradox.
The productivity paradox. It is arguably the single most important metric for understanding the UK's current 2026 stagnation.
We really need to be clear about what this means in practice, because the UK is suffering from this bizarre economic reality where you have the glittering financial hub of Europe operating at the bleeding edge of global capital.
Yet, if you measure the actual economic output per hour worked outside of London, the numbers look closer to a developing nation than a G7 powerhouse.
It's wild. Before 2008, UK productivity was growing at roughly 2% a year, driving up wages and living standards.
After 2008, it practically flatlined.
So let's break down exactly why this paradox exists. Because it's not that British workers suddenly forgot how to work hard.
No, not at all.
It is a profound systemic failure of capital allocation. If you look at the mechanics of UK businesses compared to their counterparts in the US or Germany, British companies are incredibly risk-averse.
Extremely.
They simply do not invest in research and development, new software, or advanced machinery at the same rate.
Exactly. The UK capital markets have historically heavily incentivized short-term shareholder dividends over long-term capital reinvestment.
It's the short-termism again.
Right. If a German manufacturing firm makes a massive profit, the cultural and financial expectation is that a significant portion of that capital goes right back into buying state-of-the-art robotics for the factory floor.
But if a UK firm makes a massive profit, the pressure is immense to distribute that cash to shareholders immediately.
And you compound that chronic underinvestment by the private sector with a government that systematically underinvested in infrastructure.
Leaving the country with an outdated rail network, a strained power grid, inadequate housing mobility.
And you get an economy that is working significantly longer hours but producing relatively less wealth.
You also have a massive failure in human capital investment. The UK produces elite graduates from Oxford, Cambridge, and Imperial College,
Some of the best in the world.
but struggles immensely with mid-level technical and vocational training. So you have brilliant software architects, but a critical shortage of the advanced technicians needed to actually build and maintain modern infrastructure.
This creates a fundamentally unbalanced national foundation. The UK entered the 2010s with an economy built almost entirely on the frictionless export of complex services, carrying the dead weight of massive regional inequality and suffering from a chronic allergy to long-term capital investment.
The foundation was already deeply compromised by dry rot,
It was incredibly fragile.
which brings us to the moment they decided to essentially take a sledgehammer to the load-bearing walls of that already fragile house.
The Brexit gamble.
We have to examine how the decision to leave the European Union acted as a massive historic accelerant to this relative decline. Let's look at the actual 2025-2026 data of the National Bureau of Economic Research and leading economists.
The numbers are staggering.
They really are. By 2025, leaving the EU resulted in a cumulative GDP hit of 6 to 8% compared to a hypothetical scenario where the UK had remained in the single market.
We have to pause and respect the sheer scale of a 6 to 8% structural reduction in GDP.
Yeah, that is not a minor cyclical recession.
No. That means the entire British economy is structurally 6 to 8% smaller than its baseline potential. We're talking about tens of billions of pounds perpetually wiped from the national ledger.
Which translates directly into massive shortfalls in tax revenue.
Exactly. Which then forces governments to either slash public services, borrow at exorbitant rates, or radically increase taxes on a population that is already experiencing zero real wage growth.
And the internal data points from the NBER research are even more illustrative of the mechanics of this decline. Business investment, which we just established, was already the UK's Achilles heel, plummeted by an additional 12 to 18%.
Let me repeat that. 12 to 18% drop in investment.
Employment and productivity both took a further 3 to 4% permanent hit. And the Office for Budget Responsibility has now baked a permanent 15% drop in total trade intensity into all their long-term forecasts.
To understand how a single political decision triggers an 18% drop in business investment, we really have to look back at the original strategic motivations for the 2016 referendum.
And contrast those aspirations with the brutal reality of modern economic mechanics.
Right. So the primary argument pushed by proponents of the movement was this vision of global Britain.
The idea was that the EU was a stagnant, overly regulated, slow-growing bloc.
And by breaking free of the EU's customs union and single market, the UK could rapidly pivot to faster-growing markets in the Indo-Pacific and the Americas.
They argued they could slash red tape, create a highly agile, low-tax Singapore-on-Thames regulatory environment,
and completely control their immigration levers to prioritize high-value global talent over unskilled European labor.
Those were the stated strategic goals.
But when we evaluate whether these objectives were actually achievable given modern economic realities, the historical evidence of the last decade confirms a severe miscalculation regarding the nature of 21st century global trade.
The Global Britain thesis fundamentally ignore the gravity model of international trade.
A gravity model is crucial here.
Let's explain it. Because in simple terms, the gravity model dictates that countries inherently trade the most with the economies that are massive and economies that are geographically right next door.
Exactly.
You can sign a fantastic tariff-free trade deal with New Zealand, but the sheer logistical reality means you are never going to export the same volume of goods to a small population 11,000 miles away as you do to a massive market of 450 million people sitting 20 miles across the English Channel.
Precisely. By removing itself from the frictionless EU single market, the UK erected massive, insurmountable non-tariff barriers with the destination for over 40% of its exports.
And non-tariff barriers are the silent killer of international trade.
They really are.
It's not just a government slapping a 5% tax on a product. It is regulatory friction. Imagine you are a UK-based artisanal cheesemaker in Somerset.
Okay, I like cheese.
Before 2016, putting a pallet of cheddar on a truck to Paris was legally and logistically identical to sending it to Manchester.
There was zero friction.
Exactly. Now, because the UK is outside the regulatory alignment of the EU, you need a specialized veterinary health certificate for the milk.
You need to fill out complex rules of origin customs declarations.
You have to hire a specialized freight forwarding agent just to handle the border logistics.
And that friction destroys margins. Let's say your 500-pound shipment of cheese just incurred 400 pounds in administrative and logistical costs.
Suddenly, your product is completely uncompetitive in the European market.
So what does the business owner do? They don't magically find a new market in Tokyo for that cheese. They just stop exporting altogether.
Or worse, if they have the capital, they physically move their manufacturing facility out of the UK and into an EU country to avoid the friction entirely.
Taking the jobs and tax revenue with them.
And it gets infinitely more complex for advanced manufacturing. Think about the automotive industry.
Oh, car manufacturing is a nightmare for this.
A modern car is made of thousands of parts crossing borders dozens of times before final assembly. The new rules of origin dictate that for a UK-built car to be exported tariff-free into the EU, a specific, highly defined percentage of its parts must originate in the UK or the EU.
The sheer bureaucratic nightmare of a factory manager having to legally prove the exact geographic provenance of, the microchips in the steering wheel and the rubber in the tires.
It requires entire new departments of compliance officers.
And this directly explains that colossal misallocation of human capital and the resulting collapse in investment we mentioned earlier.
Because instead of a CEO and their executive team spending the last 5 years figuring out how to develop revolutionary new products or improve assembly line robotics,
they spent years in endless, panicked meetings with supply chain consultants and trade lawyers, just desperately trying to figure out how to legally ship their existing products across the channel.
when a business is consumed by compliance and uncertainty, they freeze.
They do not build the new factory, they do not buy the new servers. Investment drops by 18%, and the productivity paradox deepens.
If we look at those investment numbers dropping by up to 18%, it sounds less like a strategic pivot and more like deciding to completely rewire your house's electricity while the power is still on and without a blueprint.
That is a brutally accurate analogy.
And we have to acknowledge that this self-inflicted friction collided with massive, unavoidable global shocks.
The COVID-19 pandemic.
The massive energy crisis sparked by geopolitical conflicts. The UK economy had entirely stripped away its shock absorbers right before driving over a cliff.
So the question is, was this a strategic error?
Looking at the 2026 data, the historical evidence overwhelmingly points to yes. It was a massive structural miscalculation.
And recent public polling reflects a wide, deep regret across the UK population regarding the outcome of the decision.
Which naturally pivots us to the absolute crux of today's analysis. We have detailed the economic fallout. Now we must examine the mechanism that allowed this to happen.
This brings us to the democracy dilemma.
How does a highly advanced nation allow a complex, permanent, multi-decade structural realignment of its entire economic architecture to be decided by a simple, binary, yes-no public vote?
This dives right into the tension between political science and macroeconomic stability. We are exploring the fundamental role of public referendums in long-term economic planning.
Because representative democracy, where we elect officials to go to the Capitol, hire experts, read 1,000-page trade briefings, and debate policy nuances over years, that system is designed to manage complexity.
Right. But direct democracy, asking millions of people a binary question on a Tuesday, is structurally allergic to complexity.
The material analyzing the 2016 vote highlights a critical vulnerability in direct democracy, the asymmetry of information.
And it is crucial to frame this neutrally. The argument from the sources is not that voters were unintelligent.
Not at all.
The argument is that the mechanics of modern, hyper-integrated global supply chains, international trade law, and non-tariff regulatory divergence are incredibly esoteric subjects.
They require highly specialized technical knowledge to accurately evaluate.
Exactly. Distilling the entirety of the UK's integration into the European economic project down to a leave or remain ballot question inherently strips away the necessary context required to make an informed economic choice.
And the political campaigns driving referendums, they know this. In a binary vote, the campaign that can craft the simplest, most emotionally resonant, easily digestible narrative almost always wins.
Because macroeconomic policy is heavily nuanced, it's full of painful trade-offs, and frankly, deeply boring to the average person.
A detailed white paper explaining the devastating long-term impact of customs union friction on just-in-time automotive manufacturing is never going to win a political debate against a catchy, emotionally charged slogan about taking back control or restoring national sovereignty.
Referendums inherently prioritize short-term political appeal and emotional momentum over long-term national stability.
We also have to look at the demographic breakdown of how different age groups perceive the vote, because it further illustrates this systemic mismatch.
Analysis of the 2016 outcome shows a stark divide in economic literacy regarding the realities of international trade among the broader electorate.
But specifically, it highlights a lack of awareness among younger cohorts regarding the sheer permanence of the decision.
Right. The structural analysis notes that many younger voters who would statistically bear the brunt of the long-term economic friction approached the referendum without fully grasping the multi-decade consequences.
In some cases, the vote was perceived almost casually, or treated as an abstract expression of political identity,
Like a protest vote against the establishment.
rather than a legally binding directive that would permanently alter the legal framework of the nation's commerce and their own future mobility.
Which raises a profoundly uncomfortable question about accountability and the design of political structures.
If voters, especially young voters, didn't grasp the multi-decade economic fallout of this choice, is that a flaw in the concept of direct democracy itself, or is it a catastrophic failure of the political class and the media to properly explain the stakes to the public?
It really has to be a synthesis of both. It is a catastrophic failure of political leadership to call a referendum on a wildly complex issue purely to resolve an internal party dispute.
Which is historically exactly why the 2016 vote was initiated.
Exactly. They gambled the national economic architecture for short-term political management, but it also absolutely exposes the inherent danger of referendums.
Expert consensus strongly suggests that political structures relying on robust representative democracy, where dedicated civil servants and elected officials are structurally mandated to manage long-term national interests and buffer against populist sentiment, are vastly better equipped to navigate 21st century economic complexities than a one-off public vote.
The historical evidence now clearly demonstrates that allowing short-term voting trends and emotionally driven campaigns to dictate international trade policy severely undermines national stability.
The UK essentially hard-coded massive economic friction into its system based on a snapshot of public sentiment from a single day in 2016.
Right.
So the UK locked itself into a high-friction environment. To truly understand why this specific friction is causing such a devastating widening of the wealth gap in 2026, we have to pull back and return to our initial comparison.
We need to contrast the current British policy environment directly against the Australian resource-driven growth model.
We need to talk about resource luck versus policy luck.
This is where the divergence becomes incredibly clear. Let's detail the Australian model first. Australia operates an economy with a massive geological safety net.
They possess extreme resource luck.
We mentioned the hardware earlier, iron ore, coal, LNG. The demand for these commodities, particularly from the relentless Chinese manufacturing engine, provides a massive, continuous influx of foreign capital.
And it's not just having the resources in the ground, it's the sheer geographic luck of where that ground is located. Australia is sitting right on the doorstep of the Indo-Pacific, the fastest growing economic region on the planet.
They don't have to navigate complex trade agreements to sell iron ore. China needs the iron ore to build high-speed rail, so China buys it. It is a deeply pragmatic, physical transaction.
But Australia doesn't just rely on digging things out of the ground. They pair their resource luck with highly effective demographic policies.
Right. They recognize that to maintain a vibrant economy with an aging domestic population, you must aggressively import human capital.
Australia utilizes a highly sophisticated points-based immigration system that acts like a precise scalpel.
If the economy needs specialized mining engineers, neonatal nurses, or AI developers, the system is dynamically calibrated to attract and fast-track exactly those individuals from the global talent pool.
Now, contrast that dynamic, resource-rich, highly targeted environment with the UK's policy reality in 2026. As we established, the UK is a post-industrial software economy.
They do not have a geological trust fund.
So essentially, Australia has a massive geological trust fund to fall back on if they make a mistake. The UK is living paycheck to paycheck on its wits, its finance and tech sectors, meaning there is absolutely zero margin for error in its political decisions.
They rely entirely on policy luck, meaning their only competitive advantage in the global market is maintaining smart, agile, highly frictionless economic policies.
And yet they have engineered the exact opposite. They imposed severe post-Brexit trade limits on themselves, maximizing friction with the European Union.
Furthermore, the UK has cultivated a deeply embedded risk-averse culture within its institutional and regulatory establishment. Capital is heavily taxed, and infrastructure development is perpetually stalled by an archaic, labyrinthine planning and zoning system.
If you want to build a new laboratory in Cambridge or a high-speed rail line connecting Manchester to Leeds, it takes a decade of legal battles and environmental reviews before a single shovel hits the dirt.
And then you add the demographic time bomb. The UK population is aging rapidly. We are reaching the point in 2026 where the mortality rate is beginning to challenge the birth rate.
To maintain a functional labor force and task space, the UK desperately needs immigration. However, driven by the very political sentiments that fueled the 2016 referendum, the UK government has aggressively tightened its immigration policies.
They have shut off the valve of flexible European labor, which has triggered severe chronic labor shortages across critical sectors, from agriculture and hospitality to advanced manufacturing and the National Health Service.
So if you compare the outcomes directly, Australia has the natural buffer of resource wealth, geographic proximity to Asian growth, and a pragmatic pipeline for skilled labor.
Which allows them to absorb global shocks and maintain that 2% growth.
The UK has zero natural buffer, has intentionally isolated itself from its closest geographic market, operates a sluggish regulatory state, and is starving itself of the required labor force.
When an economy relies entirely on policy execution and then repeatedly executes policy poorly, the consequences are immediate, unbuffered, and deeply painful.
Which brings us to the final existential question of this deep dive. We have meticulously diagnosed the structural dry rot. We have analyzed the massive shockwave of the referendum. Now we have to look forward.
The horizon.
We have to look at the 2026 to 2035 horizon. Is the UK irrevocably doomed to this slow, managed decline, or can it be saved? Can a massive pivot toward innovation actually reverse this trend?
Well, the consensus is clear that the UK is not doomed in an apocalyptic sense. It is not going to collapse into a failed state. However, the medium-term outlook, the base case scenario stretching up to 2030, is highly constrained.
The projections show GDP growth agonizingly creeping up to perhaps 1.3 to 1.6% per year at absolute best.
And even achieving that tepid growth is going to require fighting immense macroeconomic gravity.
Right. They have an aging labor force that is rapidly shrinking the active tax base while simultaneously driving up steep pension and healthcare costs.
They have those self-imposed restricted immigration policies exacerbating labor shortages.
And perhaps most critically, the UK public debt has stabilized at a massive 95% of GDP.
That base case is essentially a mud-like scenario. The economy isn't sinking rapidly, but it's stuck in thick mud, slowly sliding further down the global economic rankings.
It completely fails to solve the productivity puzzle, and the lived experience of the average citizen is continued stagnation relative to their peers in Australia or the US.
Okay, that is the mud. But what about the stars? What is the upside potential? Because the UK still has incredible latent strengths.
Right. Can emerging hyper-growth industries like green technology and artificial intelligence provide a realistic life raft out of this mud?
That they really offer the only viable life raft. The UK possesses a world-class university ecosystem, Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, UCL, that consistently produces bleeding-edge research in AI algorithms, deep learning, and advanced life sciences.
Furthermore, the UK has massive geographic potential to dominate the green energy transition, specifically by leveraging the North Sea for colossal offshore wind installations.
Coupled with London's continued, albeit battered, expertise in complex financial services, the UK has the intellectual capital to be a dominant player in the economies of the 2030s.
But, and this is where reality hits the theory, having the intellectual capital is vastly different from commercializing and scaling that capital domestically.
Exactly. To actually reverse the stagnation trend, the UK can't just invent the new AI model. They have to build the massive data centers required to run it.
They can't just design the new offshore wind turbine. They have to build the deep-water ports and the high-voltage transmission grid required to plug that power into the national economy.
And that requires colossal, sustained capital investment.
And that is exactly where the friction becomes almost insurmountable. I mean, how do you execute massive structural reform and infrastructure investment when your public debt is at 95% of GDP and your political system is paralyzed by short-termism?
The current environment demands strict fiscal tightening just to balance the books.
The National Health Service and the state pension system are devouring an ever-increasing monumental share of the national budget simply to care for the aging population.
This leaves almost zero fiscal headroom for the government to issue the massive R&D grants or fund the high-speed rail networks needed to boost regional productivity.
So we have a situation where a deeply risk-averse private sector refuses to invest their own capital, and a heavily indebted public sector physically cannot afford to invest tax capital.
Furthermore, even if the money existed, the archaic planning laws would delay the construction of new green tech infrastructure or AI server farms by a decade.
Given that the current Labor government's highly publicized growth plan is still yielding the incredibly weak 0.8% growth data we see today in 2026, I have to ask a brutal question. Are AI and green tech actual viable life rafts? Or are they just buzzwords politicians are using to avoid admitting the UK has hit a permanent low-growth new normal?
That is the defining question for the British political class of this era. AI and green tech represent genuine, multi-trillion-dollar macroeconomic paradigm shifts. The potential is real.
That is.
But without a monumental, politically perilous pivot-slashing regulatory tape, overhauling the planning system, aggressively restructuring capital markets to incentivize domestic investment, and somehow finding the political courage to forge closer, pragmatic trade alignment with the EU to reduce friction, the UK will invent the future, but they will fail to profit from it.
The brilliant startups in Cambridge will simply be bought out and scaled by massive conglomerates in California or Shenzhen.
It is an inability to execute due to profound structural and political paralysis.
The UK is caught in a brutal trap where the immediate, overwhelming political and demographic pressures of the present are actively starving the massive long-term investments required for the future.
Precisely. They're managing the decline of the old estate rather than building the new foundation.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's distill this massive journey to its core elements. We started by confronting a stark, undeniable 2026 reality, a massive widening wealth gap, where Australia's per capita GDP is now roughly 24% higher than the United Kingdom's.
We unpacked how the UK's relative decline compared to its G7 peers and former colonies was not a sudden overnight collapse, but a slow motion cascade.
It was rooted in historical inertia, the painful loss of captive imperial markets, the brutal deindustrialization of the 1970s, and a massive strategic pivot toward a service-based economy that ultimately left entire regions behind and birthed a chronic, unsolved productivity puzzle.
And we examine how the profound shock of the Brexit referendum acted as a massive historical accelerant to that underlying vulnerability.
It inflicted a severe, permanent hit to baseline GDP, crashed business investment by up to 18%, and erected vast, highly destructive non-tariff barriers with the nation's largest trading partner.
Crucially, we explored how this pivotal moment serves as a stark, definitive example of the democracy dilemma.
It demonstrated how direct democracy mechanisms, reducing a hyper-complex, multivariable economic architecture to a binary public vote, are easily skewed by a systemic lack of technical economic literacy.
Prioritizing short-term emotional appeal over long-term national stability.
We contrasted the UK's fragile policy luck environment, where every single political misstep has immediate, unbuffered economic consequences, with Australia's robust resource luck model, which is heavily buffered by natural wealth, geographic proximity to Asian demand, and highly aggressive, targeted skilled immigration policies.
And finally, we assess the horizon. While the UK holds incredible world-class potential in emerging industries like AI and green tech, actually changing its current mud-like trajectory requires a monumental pivot toward massive capital investment and sweeping structural reform.
A pivot that may be politically impossible, given the intense gravitational pull of an aging population, a heavily indebted state, and a risk-averse political culture.
Which brings me right back to the image we started with.
The grand old estate.
The grand old estate, leaking and slowly decaying under the weight of its own history, while the practical modern beachfront property thrives. The UK is that estate. It has the history, the brilliant architecture, and the intellectual capacity to be magnificent again.
But you absolutely cannot fix a crumbling, rotting foundation by simply holding a household vote on whether you prefer the theoretical idea of a new roof, while simultaneously refusing to hire the carpenters or buy the lumber.
You eventually have to stop debating the aesthetics and actually do the hard, expensive, and deeply unpopular work of rebuilding the structure from the ground up.
Exactly. And that leaves us with a final lingering thought to mull over as we close. We've deeply analyzed the intense economic friction that is created when the intricate, delicate realities of modern international supply chains collide with the blunt instrument of a simple yes-no ballot box. As the global economy becomes infinitely more complex in the coming decades, driven by the opaque algorithms of artificial intelligence, the massive physical demands of climate transitions, and hyperconnected global commerce, have we reached a point in human history where leaving massive structural economic architecture to a simple binary public vote is simply too dangerous to ever risk again? That's all for today's deep dive.